The video was 11 seconds long. Lorenzo De Luca stood in the center of his study, the faint glow of the screen reflecting in his eyes as the clip played out in silence. Outside, the city moved like it always did, restless, indifferent. But inside the room, everything felt unnaturally still, like the air itself had paused to watch. When the video ended, he didn't move. His fingers remained wrapped around the phone, steady, controlled, as if the act of holding it together might somehow keep everything else from falling apart. For a moment, nothing existed beyond that small rectangle of light. Then he watched it again. Slower. Carefully. Not because he needed confirmation, he had already understood, but because something in him refused to accept it so easily. Something stubborn, something human. Isabella, his fiancée, tomorrow's bride, laughing. Not politely, not strategically, but openly, freely, like she had nothing to hide, like she wasn't betraying him at all. She leaned into another man, her hand resting against his chest, in a way that spoke of familiarity, of comfort, of something that clearly didn't belong to Lorenzo. The video ended again. Silence followed. Lorenzo lowered the phone slowly this time, placing it on the desk with precise care. He adjusted it slightly, aligning it with the edge, as though restoring order to something small might help him control something much larger. He waited. For anger, for rage, for the sharp, familiar instinct that had carried him through every betrayal he had ever faced. But it didn't come. Instead, there was something else. A hollow stillness. A quiet emptiness that settled into his chest without asking permission. He exhaled slowly, realizing only then that he had been holding his breath. Thunder rolled in the distance. Rain followed, soft at first, then steady, tapping against the windows like a quiet insistence. Lorenzo loosened his tie, his fingers moving automatically. His mind began to shift into motion, calculating, reorganizing, preparing for the consequences that would follow. The wedding would be handled, the alliance reconsidered, the damage contained. Everything would be resolved. Everything. Except this unfamiliar feeling. He frowned slightly, not out of confusion but out of irritation. He did not like things he could not immediately define. After a moment, he picked up the phone again, staring at the blank screen as if expecting it to offer an explanation. It didn't. He set it down again, this time without adjusting it. And then he turned and walked out of the study, not toward his men, not toward his office. He walked down the long corridor, past marble floors and quiet wealth, past portraits of men who had built empires on power and fear. His footsteps were steady, but his thoughts weren't. Because beneath the calm exterior, something subtle had shifted. Something he hadn't yet named. He reached the kitchen without realizing how. The door was slightly open. Warm light spilled out into the hallway. And she was there. Elena Rossi stood at the counter, sleeves pushed up, flour dusting her wrists. Her hair had loosened from its knot, falling softly around her face in a way that felt unintentional. It was nearly midnight, and she was baking. Not for guests, not for an event, just because. She looked up when he entered. Just once. And in that single glance, something in her expression changed. Not fear, not surprise. Recognition. She didn't ask what happened, didn't move toward him, didn't fill the room with unnecessary words. She simply reached for another cup, poured tea, set it in front of him. "It's still hot," she said softly. That was all. And somehow, that simple, quiet gesture unsettled him more than the betrayal had. Because everyone in his world wanted something. Everyone had a purpose, but her. She wanted nothing. He sat down slowly, like the act itself required thought. And for the first time in years, Lorenzo De Luca didn't feel powerful. He felt human. And he didn't yet understand why that mattered. The kitchen carried a warmth the rest of the estate never managed to hold. It wasn't just the heat from the oven or the soft glow of the overhead lights. It was something quieter, something that lingered in the air like a memory you couldn't quite place but didn't want to lose. Lorenzo noticed it the moment he sat down. Not consciously, not in a way he could immediately define. But his shoulders lowered slightly. His breathing steadied. The tightness in his chest, subtle but persistent since watching the video, eased just enough for him to notice the difference. Elena sat across from him, her hands wrapped loosely around her cup. She didn't stare at him, didn't study him the way others would have. She simply allowed the moment to exist without pressure. That alone made him aware of her. "You knew," he said after a while, his voice low, measured. It wasn't an accusation, more like he was placing a thought into the space between them to see how it would settle. Elena glanced up, her expression calm. I knew something felt wrong," she replied. "Not what?" "Honest? Simple? Uncomplicated?" He nodded once, absorbing that. "I was going to marry her tomorrow." "I know." There was no shock in her voice. No pity. Just acknowledgement. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It didn't stretch awkwardly or demand to be filled. It simply remained. Lorenzo picked up the cup and took a sip. The tea was hot, grounding, real in a way that nothing else had been that night. "Are you angry?" Elena asked gently. The question lingered. He considered it. Really considered it. Because anger would have made sense. Anger would have been easy. But when he searched for it, there was nothing. He shook his head. "No." The answer felt strange, unfamiliar. Elena watched him for a moment longer. "Are you hurt?" That question landed deeper. Not sharp, not invasive, but precise. Lorenzo looked down at the tea in his hands, watching the faint ripple on its surface. "I don't know," he admitted. The truth settled heavily in the room. Because he always knew, always understood, always had control over his own reactions. But this uncertainty felt like standing on unfamiliar ground. Elena didn't respond immediately. She didn't offer comfort, didn't try to soften the moment. She simply stayed. And that quiet, steady presence did something no one else had ever managed to do. It gave him space. To not know. To not decide. To exist without expectation. He exhaled slowly, the tension in his chest easing just a fraction more. "You're not afraid of me," he said, shifting his gaze to her. It wasn't a question. Elena met his eyes without hesitation. I think people confuse loneliness with cruelty," she said. The words landed with unexpected weight. Something in his expression changed, subtle, almost imperceptible, but real. Because no one had ever said it like that before. No one had ever looked at him and seen something other than power. Lorenzo leaned back slightly in his chair, studying her in a way he hadn't allowed himself to before. She wasn't extraordinary in the way his world defined it. No polished elegance, no calculated charm. Just quiet presence. And yet, somehow, she unsettled him more than anyone else ever had. He set the cup down carefully. The room remained still. And for the first time in a very long time, Lorenzo didn't feel the need to control what came next. The cathedral was designed to impress. High ceilings stretched upward, lined with intricate carvings that spoke of history, power, and permanence. Light filtered through stained glass windows, casting soft colors across polished marble floors. Everything about it was perfect. That was the problem. Nothing about this day had ever been about love. It was about alliances, power, control. And Lorenzo understood that better than anyone. He stood at the altar, hands relaxed at his sides, his posture effortless in its authority. The room was filled with people who mattered, families, rivals, allies, each one watching, calculating, waiting. The bride was late. Whispers moved through the crowd like a quiet ripple. Lorenzo didn't react. He didn't check the time, didn't shift his weight. He simply stood there, still as stone. Because inside, something had already ended. When Isabella finally appeared, she did so with confidence. Radiant, composed, beautiful in a way that had been carefully maintained. She walked down the aisle slowly, deliberately, her gaze fixed on him as though nothing in the world could disrupt what was about to happen, as though she had already won. Lorenzo watched her approach, closer, closer, until she stood directly in front of him. The priest began speaking. The room fell silent. All attention focused forward. And then, Lorenzo turned. The movement was small, controlled, but it shifted everything. A screen behind the altar flickered to life. For a second, no one understood. Then the video began. 11 seconds. That was all it took. Gasps filled the room. Shock spread like a wave, moving from the back rows to the front. Isabella froze. Her composure shattered in an instant. The flowers in her hands trembled. Across the aisle, her father moved. But Lorenzo's men were faster. The tension in the room snapped tight. Lorenzo turned back slowly, his gaze settling on Isabella. There was no anger in his expression, no visible emotion at all. And somehow, that made it worse. "This wedding," he said quietly, "is over." His voice wasn't loud, but it carried, because everyone in the room understood what it meant. Final. Irreversible. He didn't wait for a response, didn't look back. He simply turned and walked away. The sound of his footsteps echoed faintly against the marble. Behind him, chaos began to build. Voices rose, movement spread. But Lorenzo didn't stop. He stepped outside into the cool air, the rain hitting his face in steady drops. And for a moment, just a moment, he stood there, still, breathing, letting the silence return. Because despite everything that had just happened, the loudest thing in his world was still the quiet inside his chest. The city expected a reaction. It always did. When something like that happened, when a public alliance collapsed in front of the most powerful families, there was supposed to be retaliation, violence, consequences that echoed through the streets as a warning. But nothing came. At least, nothing visible. Lorenzo returned to his estate that morning without a word. The drive was silent, the city passing by in blurred reflections against rain-streaked glass. His men didn't ask questions. They knew better. He stepped out of the car, adjusted his jacket, and walked inside like nothing had changed. But everything had. The house felt different. Or maybe he did. He moved through the halls with the same controlled presence, yet acknowledging no one, issuing no instructions. If anyone expected anger, they didn't see it. If anyone expected weakness, they didn't see that either. What they saw was distance. And distance, in a man like Lorenzo, was far more dangerous than rage. But there was one place where that distance didn't hold: the kitchen. That night, without thinking about it, he found himself there again. Elena was standing by the stove, stirring something slowly, her movement steady and unhurried. The quiet rhythm of it filled the space in a way that felt grounding. She didn't turn immediately when he entered. Only after a moment did she glance over her shoulder. "You're back," she said simply. No surprise, no questions, just acknowledgement. Lorenzo leaned against the counter, loosening his cuff slightly. "Everyone's talking," she added. "You let them," he replied. She nodded, accepting that answer without pushing further. That was something he noticed about her. She didn't press, didn't demand. She allowed things to exist as they were, and somehow that made him want to stay longer than he intended. He watched her work for a moment. The small movements, the quiet focus. It was ordinary, completely ordinary. And yet, it felt unfamiliar. "You're not afraid of me," he said after a while. Elena turned to face him fully this time. "No," she said. The answer came easily, without hesitation, without calculation. Lorenzo studied her. "Why?" She held his gaze, her expression thoughtful. "I think the world mistakes loneliness for cruelty," she said. The words settled into the room like something heavier than they should have been, because they were true, and because no one had ever said it like that before. For a brief moment, something shifted in his expression, something unguarded. Then it was gone. He straightened slightly, pushing himself away from the counter. But he didn't leave. Instead, he stayed. And for the first time since the wedding, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt steady. The attack came without warning. It started with a sound, sharp, metallic, wrong. Then, gunfire. The gates shattered under the force, the noise tearing through the night like a crack in the world itself. Within seconds, the estate shifted from silence to chaos. Men moved fast, weapons drawn, voices sharp and controlled. Lorenzo stepped into the corridor, already focused, already calculating. His expression didn't change. His pace didn't quicken, but everything about him shifted. And this was familiar. This was something he understood. He moved through the house, issuing instructions in low, precise tones. Security tightened. Positions adjusted. Every movement deliberate. Until Elena is missing. The words cut through everything. For a fraction of a second, he stopped. Not visibly. Not in a way anyone else would notice. But inside, something shifted. Completely. He turned. Where? Kitchen. She's not there. His jaw tightened. The world narrowed. This wasn't strategy anymore. This wasn't business. This was personal. And personal was far more dangerous. The note arrived within the hour. Short, direct. They had her. They wanted leverage. Lorenzo read it once, then set it down slowly. The room waited. His men watched, expecting orders, expecting anger, expecting something explosive. But when he looked up, his expression was calm. Too calm. "I'll handle it," he said. And that was when they understood. This wasn't going to be negotiation. This was going to be something else entirely. Something final. Lorenzo reached for his coat, pulled it on with steady hands, every movement controlled, every step deliberate. Because the moment they took her, they made a mistake. And by morning, they would understand exactly how serious that mistake had been. The docks were quiet at night. Not peaceful, never peaceful, but quiet in the way dangerous places often were. The kind of quiet that carried weight, that held secrets beneath its surface like dark water. Rain fell steadily, soaking the ground, turning everything into reflections of dim light and broken shapes. Lorenzo stepped out of the car alone. No guards, no backup, and that wasn't because he didn't have men willing to follow him into anything. It was because this required something else. Ownership. A message that could not be delivered through anyone but him. He closed the car door gently, the sound barely audible beneath the rain, and began walking toward the warehouse. Each step was steady, measured, unhurried. Like time itself was something he controlled. Inside, the air smelled like rust and oil. And fear. Elena sat in the center of the room, tied to a chair. Her posture was straight, her chin slightly raised. She was afraid, he could see it. But it wasn't the loud kind. It wasn't panic. It was contained, controlled, the way people hold themselves together when they refuse to break in front of others. Her eyes found his the moment he entered. And something in her expression changed. Not relief. Not quite. Something steadier. Like his presence alone had shifted the balance of the room. The men around her started talking. Demands, territory, power. They spoke like they believed they had leverage, like they didn't fully understand who they were dealing with. Lorenzo didn't interrupt. He didn't react. He let them speak, let them finish. Because men like him didn't rush. They concluded. When the last voice fell silent, he tilted his head slightly, considering, almost thoughtful. Then, everything changed. What followed wasn't loud. It wasn't chaotic. It was precise, decisive. Every movement intentional, every action final. By the time the rain began to slow outside, the warehouse was quiet again. But this time the silence was different. Permanent. Lorenzo walked toward Elena, cutting the ropes with steady hands. "Yes, you're safe," he said quietly. Her breath was uneven, but she didn't collapse. Didn't fall apart. She simply stood when he helped her, her fingers gripping his coat as if anchoring herself to something solid. He took off his coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. She didn't ask what had happened, didn't look behind him. She didn't need to. She understood. And somehow, that understanding made the moment heavier. As they stepped back into the night, the rain softened to a mist. The city waited, unaware of what had just shifted. Elena's hand found his in the dark. Small, warm, real. Lorenzo glanced down at it briefly, then forward again. And in that quiet walk back to the car, he understood something he hadn't allowed himself to before. This wasn't temporary. This wasn't something he could walk away from. This was irreversible. The garden felt different at night. During the day, it was controlled, maintained, designed to impress. But at night, it softened. The edges blurred. The silence deepened. Elena sat on the stone bench near the fountain, her hands resting loosely in her lap, her gaze tilted upward toward the sky. She heard him approach, didn't turn immediately, just waited. Lorenzo stopped a few steps away, watching her. Not as a leader, not as a man assessing a situation, just watching. "You should leave this life," he said finally. The words felt heavier than they sounded. Elena turned to look at him. "Do you want me to?" The question settled between them. Simple, direct, dangerous. He didn't answer immediately, because the truth wasn't simple. He wanted her safe, away from everything his world carried. But he also wanted her here, where he could see her, where he could hear her, where she existed in the same space as him. "No," he said quietly. The word felt like a decision. "I want you where I can see you." A pause. "Where I know you're safe." Another. "Where I can hear you in the kitchen." Elena's expression softened slightly. "That sounds like love," she said. Lorenzo looked at her. Really looked. And for once, he didn't calculate, didn't measure, didn't protect himself. "It is," he said. The truth settled into the space between them. Undeniable, unavoidable. Elena inhaled slowly. Not surprised, not overwhelmed, just aware. "Do you understand what that means?" she asked. "Yes?" "You don't do anything halfway." "No." "And this isn't a safe life." "I know." The honesty in his voice didn't waver, because he wasn't offering her comfort. He was offering her truth. Elena studied him for a moment longer. Then she reached out, took his hand. Her grip was steady, certain. "I would choose this anyway," she said. And that was the moment everything changed. Not the confession, not the words, but the choice. Because love, in their world, wasn't about emotion, it was about decision. And she had just made hers. Lorenzo lifted her hand slightly, his gaze lingering on it before bringing it briefly to his lips. A small gesture. Quiet, but real. And in that moment, the most feared man in the city allowed himself something he had denied for years. Connection. Power never gave anything without taking something in return. Lorenzo had always known that, had built his entire life around that understanding. But knowing it and living it were different things. When the moment the city realized Elena mattered, everything shifted. Whispers spread. Enemies paid attention. Because love, in their world, wasn't a strength. It was leverage. And leverage was meant to be used. The first signs were subtle. Small disruptions. Minor challenges. Nothing direct. Nothing obvious. But Lorenzo saw it. Felt it. Recognized the pattern immediately. They were testing him, waiting, watching, hoping he would hesitate. They misunderstood something important. He didn't hesitate. He adapted. Security tightened. Movements changed. Every step calculated. Every weakness covered. But it wasn't enough, because once a vulnerability existed, it couldn't be unseen. And eventually, they moved. 3 families, unified, bold, Stupid? They thought love had softened him, made him predictable. They were wrong. Yet because a man with nothing to lose is dangerous. But a man with something to protect is unstoppable. The response wasn't immediate. It wasn't loud. It was strategic, precise, systematic. By the time they realized what was happening, it was already too late. One by one, their positions collapsed, their alliances fractured, their influence disappeared. Not violently, not publicly, but completely. Lorenzo didn't destroy them, he removed them. And that was far worse. When it was over, the city felt different. Quieter. More careful. Because the message had been delivered clearly. Touch what belongs to him, and nothing will remain of you. Elena watched it unfold from a distance. She didn't ask questions, didn't demand explanations. She understood enough. And what she understood was that this was the cost. Not just of his world, but of being part of it. One night, she found him standing by the window looking out over the city. "You didn't have to do all of that," she said softly. Lorenzo didn't turn. "Yes, I did." There was no hesitation in his voice. "No one touches what is mine." The words were simple, but the meaning behind them was absolute. Elena stepped closer. Not afraid, not uncertain, just present. And for the first time, she fully understood the depth of what she had chosen and why she wouldn't change it. The city adjusted. It always did. Power shifted, and the narrative followed. The story of Lorenzo De Luca changed. Not completely. He was still feared, still respected, still untouchable. But now, there was something else, something new. Elena. At first, it was subtle. Her presence at dinners, at meetings, at moments that mattered. No announcement. No title. Just inclusion. And that was enough. Because the way Lorenzo looked at her, the way his attention shifted toward her without thought, told everyone exactly what they needed to know. She mattered. And in his world, that meant everything. What made it more powerful was that she didn't change. She didn't try to fit into the role, didn't perform, didn't seek approval. She remained exactly who she had always been, quiet, observant, steady, and that earned respect faster than anything else could have. The men noticed, the ones who had once ignored her, dismissed her. Now, they acknowledged her, not out of fear, but out of understanding, because Lorenzo had chosen her, completely. And that wasn't something they questioned. One evening, after a long dinner, the house settled into silence, where Elena stepped into the garden, the cool air brushing against her skin. Lorenzo followed a few moments later. He stood beside her, not speaking, not needing to. "How are you?" he asked after a while. She considered the question. Honestly. "Different," she said. A small pause. "But not wrong." He nodded, because he understood that, more than anyone. "Good," he said quietly. "You should be exactly here." And for the first time, she felt it fully. Not uncertainty, not hesitation, belonging, not to the world, but to him. The chapel was small, old, quiet, hidden in the far corner of the estate. It hadn't been used in years. Tonight, it was filled with light. Candles lined the walls, their soft glow turning stone into something warm, something alive. There were no guests, no families, no alliances. Just three people. The priest, Lorenzo, Elena. She stood across from him, dressed simply, her hands steady at her sides. He stood in black, as always. But something about him had changed. Something subtle. Something real. The ceremony began. The words were familiar, traditional. But they felt different here. Because nothing about this was performance. Nothing about this was strategy. This was choice. When it was his turn to speak, Lorenzo took her hands in his. His grip was firm, certain, but not controlling. "The world gave me betrayal," he said quietly. And somehow, it gave me you. The words settled into the space like something fragile, something real. Elena's eyes softened. And I would choose you, she replied. A small breath. Even in the dark. No hesitation, no fear, just truth. The rings were simple, unremarkable, but the way he placed it on her finger, slowly, I carefully, made it mean everything. He leaned forward slightly, pressing his lips briefly against her forehead. Not a performance, not for anyone else, just for her. She placed her hand against his chest, feeling the steady rhythm beneath. Grounding, certain, real. Outside, the city continued. Unchanged, unforgiving. But inside that small chapel, none of it mattered. Because for the first time in his life, Lorenzo De Luca wasn't acting out of power. He was acting out of choice, and that made it different. That made it permanent. The candles flickered softly. The silence settled. And somewhere between the vows and the quiet that followed, something stronger than fear took hold. Not control, not power. Something else. Something far more dangerous. Love. The city still feared him, still whispered his name in the dark. But now, they feared something more. Because the most dangerous man in the city had learned how to love. And in a world built on power, that was the one thing no one could ever control.